Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. I got an email from an, I presume young, man by the name of Ken, who said, "What you say about the burden of proof is very interesting to me, especially about engaging with the question and not just saying, 'You have to prove it to me. I don't have any burden of proof, so get busy proving your idea to me.' I think part of why so many atheists, and I am an atheist at this time, say the burden of proof is on the one making a positive claim, i.e. God exists or God doesn't exist, is because so many Christians respond to questions of how do you know God exists with, well, can you prove God doesn't exist? I'm going to continue to believe God exists until someone proves to me that he, she, it doesn't. Have you heard of Matt Dillahunty? He said something about the burden of proof I find very compelling. He talked about the game of guessing how many whole gumballs are in a clear glass jar. Matt said that before you even begin to try to figure out the answer, there is one thing you absolutely know, and that is the number is either odd or even. If someone asserts that the number is even, and I say I don't believe that, that is not the same as saying I think the number is odd. The default position, before you find out the answer, is, I don't know yet. He said a God either exists or doesn't exist. For clarity, we need to keep God exists and God doesn't exist separate and examine them separately. If I say you have failed to meet your burden of proof that your God exists, I am not saying your God doesn't exist, but that you have not established that it exists. It seems to me that if the burden of proof is on the atheists to prove that Yahweh does not exist, then Christians have the burden to prove that the thousands of other gods do not exist, and if you set about trying to prove all those gods, goddesses don't exist, those believers will use the same defense as Christians use to defend their God claim, and will say you have failed to prove their deity doesn't exist. I'm wondering what you would say I am missing here. This video will answer this question. I'd like to preface my video by saying that the Christians who respond to questions about how one can know the faith is true with, "How can you know it's false?" are simply not the people to talk to. Most people, regardless of belief system or topic, are simple people, and simple people are not good at explaining things. This is true whether you're talking about religion, engineering, science, art, swing dance, winemaking, or anything else. Only some people are good at explaining things, and these are the people you should seek out when you want an explanation. But, unlike in engineering, science, art, swing dancing, winemaking, or just about anything else, Christians who are good at teaching will happily teach you about the truth of Christianity for free. There are tons of free apologetical materials online and plenty of excellent books available at basically the cost of printing. And plenty of Christians will happily buy books for people who are sincerely seeking the truth. With that out of the way, there's one other thing which will help for us to establish before we proceed. Every positive claim is convertible to a negative claim, and vice versa. This is because a double negative is equivalent to a positive. You can say that a man is dead, or not dead, and they mean the same thing. If you want to make it sound better, just give not dead a name, like alive. This will come up in a bit. So the first thing to say about Matt Dillahunty's jar of gumballs is that his explicit conclusion is entirely true. To not come to a conclusion and to conclude a negative are not the same thing. To not be convinced that somebody is right and to be convinced that they are wrong are not the same thing. To not accept the truth of a proposition and to accept the truth of its negation is not the same thing. Here's the thing. No one ever thought that they were the same thing. What he is saying is true, but it is also trivial and irrelevant to the subject of whether God exists as it is discussed by human beings. And, to be clear, by God I mean the uncreated creator of all that is, the unchanging source of all change, the necessary source of all contingency, the ground of all being, the reason why there is something rather than nothing. I don't care about big guys with hammers or worshipping the sun. If Thor exists, at most he is a more powerful creature than I am, but still just a creature. This is utterly unlike the source of every moment of my, and if he exists, Thor's, existence. Matt Dillahunty's example is about whether the number of gumballs in a jar is odd or even. Now, within the example, the number of gumballs has no practical consequence, and whether the number is even or odd has, if possible, even less significance. It doesn't matter in the slightest to anyone. This is not true of whether God exists, however. There is nothing that matters more, and nothing of greater practical consequence than whether God exists. It affects every aspect of life, in every moment of life. And everything you do is going to be consistent either with God existing and having created the universe on purpose and with meaning, and therefore with a nature out of which flows a particular morality, or it won't be. I talked about this at length in my video Atheist Morality, but the short version is that morality either flows out of human nature, which can only have been given to us by a rational creator, or what you call morality is just a name for people doing whatever they want, which needs no name. The short version is that you can't know whether you're using or misusing something until you know what it's for. In Dillahunty's made-up example, you can ignore the question, and the question goes away. But real life doesn't go away when you stop believing in it. In a moment, I'm going to present a much better analogy for the situation human beings find ourselves in, but first, I want to point out that you can see this flaw even in Dillahunty's example, just by looking at where he stops. He ends the example before he writes his name and contact info and a number on a piece of paper and puts it in the submission box. The jar of gumballs is part of a contest. If you look up the video where he first presents this analogy, it's explicitly part of it. And yet, in the analogy, he never enters the contest. He apparently just loses by not trying. Of course, he couldn't enter the contest in his analogy, because if he did, the number he wrote down, being a specific number, would have to be odd or even. The only way he can remain uncommitted is by not playing the game for which the jar of gumballs was set out. Let's be really clear here. This is a strategy to guarantee that you lose. This is, literally, a loser's strategy. But even if you include the parts which were left out of his analogy, a jar of gumballs just isn't much like real life. So let's take a different example, which has the same point that the gumball example does, but like real life involves skill and effort, and the results actually matter. Suppose you are the umpire in a baseball game. It's the bottom of the 9th inning in the last game of the World Series. There are 2 outs, and the score is tied. A ground ball is hit, and the runner on third base dashes madly towards home plate. The shortstop initially fumbles the ball, but the third baseman ran behind him and picks up the ball, then throws it home. The catcher catches the ball and tags the runner as he slides into home plate. Now, one thing you know for sure is that the runner is either out or safe. The runner says to you that he's safe, but doesn't offer enough evidence to convince you. The catcher says that the runner is out, but also doesn't offer enough evidence to convince you. If you simply announce that you don't have enough evidence to make a call, and so you're going home now, this is definitely very different from calling the runner safe because you believe he's safe, or calling the runner out because you believe he's out. For one thing, you're going to be fired from your job as umpire, and may well be hanged from the nearest lamppost by outraged fans before you make it home. And now we come to the big problem with the umpire who refuses to come to a conclusion if the players don't prove their case to his satisfaction. Why is he being so damn lazy? As the umpire, it's his job to know whether the runner is safe or out. That's the whole reason he's on the field at all. It's not the players' jobs to prove that they succeeded in their goals. It's his job to pay attention to the game closely enough to know who succeeded and who failed. If he spends the entire baseball game in a closet, playing video games, and then throws up his hands when a call is necessary, he's not nobly committed to intellectual honesty. He's just neglecting his duty. But bear in mind, this example does prove, just as much as the marble example, that there is a difference between refusing to commit to a side and committing to the negative side. Does anyone wonder why Matt Dillahunty picked his jar of gumballs example and not this umpire in a baseball game example? But throwing up one's hands and going home, in the real world this is the equivalent of freezing motionless or perhaps committing suicide, is not what people actually do. Atheists like Matt Dillahunty define some course of action as the default. They never, of course, explain why it's the default, since they can't, since there's no such thing as a default when it comes to morality, and then do that if the contrary isn't proven to them. So let's look at that. Suppose you decide to define safe as a positive claim and out as the negative claim, then, without believing that the runner is actually out, call him out since the runner didn't satisfactorily prove his positive claim. So what? You are still calling him out. That you don't really believe him out changes exactly nothing about what you're doing. The game will go into overtime just as much as if you actually believed your call was correct. Suppose you did the contrary and defined out as the positive claim and safe as the negative claim, then, without believing that the runner is actually safe, call him safe since the catcher hasn't satisfactorily proven his positive claim. Again, So what? The runner is still just as safe, the run counts just as much, and the team has won the game to exactly the same degree as if you actually believed that your call was correct. Incidentally, I've heard it claimed that there is a rule in baseball that the tie goes to the runner. Several things need to be said about this. First, if you look this up, it refers not to uncertainty on the umpire's part, but to the case when the ball and the batter-turned-runner reach first base at the exact same instant such that neither arrives ahead of the other. Second, this is not a rule in baseball, but rather an interpretation of the rules, which not all Major League umpires subscribe to. And third, let's ignore those first two and suppose this actually was a rule for there being a default to resolve epistemic uncertainty. Find me a case in real life where the following happened. In a situation like above, bottom of the ninth and so forth, where the umpire wasn't paying attention and doesn't know what happened at home plate, so he follows the default and calls the runner safe. The team manager from the team who has now lost comes up to the umpire, screaming at him that he must be incompetent, stupid, blind, and on drugs. The umpire calmly tells him, "Sir, I wasn't actually looking when the play happened, and so I went with the default call of safe." The team manager, clearly taken aback, stammers and says, "Oh man, I'm so sorry for what I said. I thought you actually thought that the runner was safe. Oh man, I didn't realize you had no idea what happened and just went with the default call. I take back everything I said about you being incompetent. Please, accept my most sincere apologies for insulting your umpiring. You are a credit to your profession." Find me that, preferably in video, but I'll accept newspaper reports. If an umpire makes a bad call because he was going with some default because he didn't know what happened, this is not better than making a bad call because he was mistaken. It's still a bad call, and it's still his fault because he didn't take the trouble to make a good call. If you cheat on your wife with her sister but don't really mean it, you've still cheated on your wife. If you cheat on your wife with her sister and father a bastard, that child exists just as much and has the same needs whether or not you actually believe that you should have cheated. This whole project of trying to do things without having them count is just pure cowardice. There's no honor in doing things without thinking that you should do them, and there's even less in, if you don't know what you should be doing, not spending every waking moment of your life trying to find out what you should be doing. The Matt Dillahunties of the world are busy trying to say that if I shoot you in the head because I believe you're a zombie, I'm crazy, but if I shoot you in the head because I haven't been convinced that you're not a zombie, that is, that you're alive, I'm the pinnacle of rationality. And since this is the internet, don't take this analogy literally. Shooting someone in the head symbolizes, say, fornication, and because they're a zombie, symbolizes sex being purely about pleasure. Now, to come to the crux of the matter, the only reason anyone likes this irrelevant gumball example is that it sneaks in the assumption that it doesn't matter whether God exists. Just like a stage magician getting you to focus on the hand that's pretending to have the coin, when the coin is actually in the hand that you're not looking at, this example is purportedly about whether or not indecision is identical to disbelief, but in reality is about whether disbelief matters. I talked about this before, but to go over it again because it is so important, there is no truth more important to human life than whether or not God exists. I've also covered the practical importance of the question of whether God exists in my video Atheism Changes Everything, but just consider for a moment that if a rational, loving God created the world, we have a nature out of which morality flows, so morality is not merely the arbitrary question of what people happen to approve of. We have a soul which can live past the death of the body and live with the consequences of whether we acted in accordance with our nature or against it. That is, it is possible we will go to some sort of heaven or some sort of hell, with justice actually being enforced in the end. There is no such thing as a hidden deed. It is not possible to get away with something merely because no other human beings know about it. Having a common creator, all human beings are a sort of sibling. We can have duties to strangers, and even to enemies. The good things in life like beauty can be true, and not merely meaningless preferences. Someone who thinks that whether these things are true is like whether the number of gumballs in a jar is odd or even, has to have replaced his brains with rat droppings, then taken the rat droppings out and burned them, then used a hose to suck even the air out of the empty cavity in his skull so that in place of his brain there is now only vacuum. The idea that it doesn't really matter whether God exists is not even within spitting distance of a reasonable position. It's not within sight of a reasonable position. It's not on the same planet as a reasonable position. And even on just a mundane, nitty-gritty level, practicing religious people are less likely to smoke, to abuse alcohol, and to divorce, just to name a few things. In the studies showing this, practicing tends to mean regularly attending church. Correlational studies should always be taken with a grain of salt, but does your position on whether there are an odd or even number of gumballs in a jar have that sort of effect? Or even just correlate with that sort of effect? And yet, you see this from atheists all the time. They say, I don't believe in God and I'm able to go on living without any problems. Perhaps, but how do they live their life? Just take a look at the atheists who make these arguments about how their life is unaffected by disbelief. It's not a pleasant thing to have to point out, but when they say this, then take a look. Do they refrain from excessive alcohol, recreational drugs, pornography, fornication, adultery, gossiping, backstabbing, and so forth? Do they further spend their own time, energy, and money being generous to people who can't repay them? Do they constantly strive for greater self-control, that all they may do be upright and good? Is their life marked by a sense of gratitude for all the good things they've received, including existence, intelligence, and the opportunity to see beauty and help others? Now, Christians fall short of these things all the time. It's a terrible shame, but it is true, that not all Christians are saints. But are any atheists saints? Just take a look at them. Is there a single atheist anywhere who hasn't noticed that the world being a meaningless accident that only has the meaning they give it, that moment, has the implication that whatever they find hard isn't worth doing, and whatever temptation they want to give into is justified? Especially over time. Atheism is, I fear, a degenerative disease. So take a look at the older atheists. How many of them have any sort of remarkable virtue or self-control? How many ascetics practicing self-denial do you find? How many of them have dedicated their life to helping people who can't contribute to their Patreon account? How many of them have forsworn sex so that they may dedicate all of their time to service? Heck, how many of them spend even 1 hour a week set aside for appreciating that existence exists and being grateful for it? Most of the atheists I know talk about how going to church once a week is such an unbearable burden that you would think they were talking about being woken up at 2 a.m. to spend 14 hours in a hot standing cell without food or water. So yes, there is theoretically a difference between acting as if God does not exist because you believe that he does not exist, versus because you merely assume that he does not exist. There is not, however, a practical difference between these two things. The difference doesn't matter in the slightest. Well, actually, that's not quite true. Someone who believes he knows that God does not exist is justified in not spending time trying to find out whether God exists, since he already has an answer with which he is satisfied. Someone who claims to not know, and therefore to have no idea whether what he is doing is good, evil, or indifferent, had better be spending all of the time and effort he can spare from immediate necessity trying to find out the answer. Consider a man holding a gun. If he knows that it is unloaded, because he has verified it himself, including checking the chamber, it is fine for him to wave the gun around, or even to point it at someone and pull the trigger, since he knows he will certainly do no harm. A man who has no idea whether the gun is loaded is grossly irresponsible for doing the same thing, and no amount of him saying that it has not been proven to him that the gun is loaded changes that he is being a bad man. Men who exist in the world will act or not act in each moment they continue to exist. It is their first responsibility to find out what they should do and what they should refrain from doing. And there is nothing more important to answering that question than whether a rational God created the world and, if so, what purpose and nature he gave it. Someone who tries to answer that question, even if he comes up with the wrong answer, is at least trying to be a decent human being. Someone who merely ignores the question isn't even trying to be human. Ironically, though perhaps it shouldn't be surprising, it's that latter group who seems to spend the most time boasting about how rational they are. Until next time, may you hit everything you aim at